that's taking place. I know Mark's asked me to lead some prayers for Paris, but I'm going to do that towards the end of my message because I think we'll be able to fit that in with that. But if you've got a Bible, turn with me to Exodus chapter 14. I'm going to read some verses together in a few moments. Just a couple of things. If you're involved or you're expected to be at the I Know training on Wednesday, if you've got a laptop, bring that with you, okay? That'll be really helpful as we go through what the benefits of the system. So it'll be really good if you've got a laptop or a tablet of some kind that you can come through, bring with you to log in. So the guy that's going to come and do the training with us will be able to take us through that. And then again, just to reinforce what Mark said about next Sunday, Stuart is an incredible guy. I don't know how many of you were here, probably about 7 years ago it was, 7 or 8 years ago when Stuart came and spoke when we were at Manchester Road. But it leads a great church down at CLC. It was on his first night as the new pastor there that I gave my life to Jesus. And so that was just almost 21 years ago. It'll be on the 6th of February in 2016. It'll be 21 years since that happened. But Stu's a great guy, bringing his wife Amanda, one of their children, Lydia, with him. So we're really looking forward to next weekend. Really want to encourage you to come, be early for church, and let's be excited about all that God's going to say through him to us next weekend. Is that okay? Are you up for it next weekend? Yeah. Brilliant. How many of you have ever found yourself in a situation where you felt like you've come to something of a dead end, or maybe a bit of an impasse in your life, where maybe you believe in your heart that you're heading in the right direction, you're doing what you believe God has been saying to you, but the barriers have come down, there seems to be some kind of impasse standing in front of you. Come out. And there seems to be something that's stopping you from taking those next steps forward. Does anyone know what I mean when I say that? Could be a job or a career perhaps that you believe in God has called you to, but that hasn't come through yet the way that you hoped it would. Could be a relationship that you really believe he's leading you into, but for some reason it's difficult to take those next steps forward. There seems to be something preventing you from doing that. Could be a business partnership perhaps of some kind that you feel a little bit trapped in, and you really feel that you need to get out of that, but that you can't see any kind of exit strategy developing. Perhaps it's something financial. The money's dried up. It's not that you've dishonored God with your money, but something has happened there that the money's dried up and you need some kind of miracle to get you back on track. Could even be something to do with your walk with God, a sin perhaps that seems to have some kind of mastery over you that you can't seem to break free from. If you've ever been in that kind of situation, it can be really difficult, can't it? It can be a frustrating place to find yourself in. There may be some of you here this morning who are saying to yourself, that's exactly where I feel I'm at right now. That song that Craig and the team introduced to us a few moments ago, it's a song that's blessed me immensely over the past number of weeks since I first heard that. It has that chorus, where there is no way, you make a way. Refers to the fact that when we were lost in our sins, when we were in a place where we had no human way of saving ourselves, God made that way possible for us, didn't he? I love how the psalmist puts it, Psalm 40 and verse 2. He says that he lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire, and set my feet upon a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. How many of you can testify to that this morning? That's what he's done for you. We serve a faithful God, don't we? Today, whether it was no way, he made a way possible for us to know him. But you know, the truth is, I believe that doesn't just apply to our salvation, but can apply to so many other areas of our lives. So many other situations that we find ourselves up against where we feel hemmed in, we feel trapped, we feel like there's something preventing us from moving forward to the things that God has for us. If you want a title for my message today, it would very simply be this: The Waymaker. He's the Waymaker. You see, where there might seem to be no way, he has this incredible ability of making a way. Out of nothing, sometimes seemingly out of nowhere, at specific moments, God breaks in and carves out a path for us to begin to move forward. And I've seen it happen over the almost 21 years I've been a Christian, I've seen God do it time and time again in my own life. I can remember just before we were married, and obviously we knew we were coming to Southport, but Georgie was looking for a job, and the industry that she was working in, where she'd been in Glasgow before we came, she was starting to look around for different jobs that she might be able to start working for, different firms. And of all the ones that she was looking at, it looked like she was either going to have to travel to Liverpool or to Manchester, which wasn't the end of the world, but it wasn't the most ideal. We were hoping to try and got something more local for her. And just as she was scouring to see what different companies were around, she came across a little family-run firm that was based in Churchtown, of all places. Can you believe that? And she got in touch with them, and they invited her to come for an interview and just to meet her. And then she came away from that interview, and I said, how did you get on? She said, well, they liked me. They were impressed with what I could offer them, but they said there's no jobs available. And we thought, well, that's probably just the way it is. They're a small firm. But they said, look, we've got your details on record. Don't you hate it when they say that to you? And so we went away from that. It was getting closer to when we were getting married, and then she had an email out of the blue saying, you know, look, following the interview that we had, the chat, we've been chatting, and we're creating a job for you. And we'd love you to come and start working for us. And it was just a 2-minute drive from where we were planning to live. How good is God? Where there was no way, God made a way. Just fast forward a few years, and we had Elliot, our firstborn, and then George was about to go back off maternity leave to the same firm. And she was only going to be going back just for 1 day a week, the Monday when I'm off, and so I'd be looking after Elliot, and she'd go back. But they wanted her to be there for at least 3 days a week. Well, we didn't want to have a childminder. We couldn't afford to have a childminder anyway, and we were thinking, well, what do we do? Meanwhile, at the same time, 90 miles away, back in Birmingham, where my mom lived, her job was coming to an abrupt ending, and to cut a long story short, she was then able to travel up here to Southport from Birmingham each week to look after us. And you might think, well, what's so special about that? The wonderful thing is, as I said, like, we couldn't have afforded to have had a childminder. The company said to George, look, we will pay. We want you to come for 3 days a week, so we will pay the expenses for you to have someone. How good is God? They paid for my mom to travel up each week, probably for over a couple of years, to come and look after her grandchild, our firstborn, at their expense. More than coincidence. Our family think we're the luckiest people alive. They say all these coincidences keep happening to you. We say it isn't coincidence. We have a God who loves us. And at times we face what might seem like impossible situations, but God has this incredible ability, doesn't he? And I can see you nodding your heads because you've experienced it in your lives too, that where there seems to be no way, when we come up against brick walls and things that seem to be stopping us from moving on into the things that we believe God has got for us, that he has this incredible ability where there is no way, that he makes a way. And over these next few minutes that we have, I want us to look at a story on a much grander scale, if you like, of where he did exactly this for the people of Israel. And I want to pick out 4 things I've identified that I believe God is wanting to deposit in our hearts today and minister to us, that will help us as we journey with him. Have a look, Exodus chapter 13. A few verses from there, from verse 17, and then we'll go into chapter 14 and read most of that. But it's headed up here, crossing the sea. Exodus 13:17. When Pharaoh let the people go, God didn't lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. And so God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt armed for battle. Into chapter 14. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They're to encamp by the sea, directly opposite Baal-zephon. And Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I'll harden Pharaoh's heart, and he'll pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. And when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We've let the Israelites go and we've lost their services." So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. And the Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite Baal-zephon. And as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians, marching after them. They were terrified, and they cried out to the Lord. And they said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." And Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. And the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." And then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I'll harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they'll go in after them. And I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." As we read on, Moses did what God asked him to do. And they went through on dry ground, and the Israelites came in after them. And then Moses was told by the Lord, verse 26, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered them all. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and a wall of water on their left. And that day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the great power the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. This is such a great story, isn't it? I've seen Charlton Heston as Moses in the Ten Commandments. I'm sure you have. I've seen Disney's adaptation of The Prince of Egypt that came out a number of years ago. And as good as they are, they can never fully capture the drama that was unfolding here of this epic story of God's love and his intervention with the people that he chose to bear his name. 9-year-old Joey was asked by his mom what he'd learnt in Sunday school that day. "Well, Mom," he said, "our teacher told us how God sent Moses behind the enemy lines on a rescue mission to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And when he got to the Red Sea, he had his engineers build a pontoon bridge, and all the people walked across safely. He then used his walkie-talkie to radio headquarters and call in an airstrike. They sent in bombers to blow up the bridge, and all the Israelites were saved." Now, Joey," his mom responded, "is that really what the teacher taught you?" And he stopped and he thought for a moment, and he said, "Of course not. But if I told you how it really happened, you'd never believe it." You see, this really is an amazing story, isn't it? I look forward one day to sitting at the feet of Moses and hearing him give his version of how it really happened when we're up there in heaven. What the jubilation of being able to go after all those years, 430 years the people were under Egypt's hand. All those years in slavery. And so the jubilation of being able to be set free after all of that. But then, of course, the uncertainty of coming to this place where they were hemmed in and uncertain of how things were going to pan out before them. And it's this point that I want us to focus on this morning, where they've come to what seems to them to be an impasse, where they've got this huge expanse of water in front of them called the Red Sea. They've got mountains either side, and then they've got Pharaoh and his army very cross right behind them, and the only thing that's separating them is a wall of fire that God has placed there between them. But for us to look at where there seemed to be no way, God broke in and made a way. What can we learn? I've got 4 things over these next 20 minutes. First thing I want to say is this. As we think about the situations that we find ourselves facing in our lives, when we come up against what might seem to be something of a Red Sea in front of us, and we don't really know how we can take those steps forward, I want to say to you this morning that what might seem like a dead end can in fact be a doorway for God to break in. What might seem like a dead end, humanly thinking, humanly speaking, can in fact be a doorway for God to break in and break through and reveal himself in a new way. You see, when we read this story and we see the reaction of the Israelites, it's easy for us to get a little bit impatient with them, isn't it? Come on, guys, God's already done this. Why weren't you trusting him? But let's be honest, how many of us, when we find ourselves in those situations, we can be a little bit like the Israelites? Hello?
Yes.
See, it's easy for us because we see the end of the story. But for those people at this time, this is all they'd ever known, for this generation. And many of them that had been before them, 400 plus years they would have been under the control of the superpower of the day, Egypt. And so breaking free from them seemed like an absolute impossibility. Even when Pharaoh did eventually let them go, it seemed like it was going to be short-lived because of what began to take place. But you know, what seemed to them like a dead end was in fact a doorway for God to break in and reveal himself in a new way for them. You know, I think of the journey that we've done as a fellowship over probably about the past 8 or 9 years it would be since we first began thinking about moving from Manchester Road to a new premises to fulfill the vision and the heart, we believe, the ministry that God's given us here in this town. And it's had its twists and turns, hasn't it? We still continue to have those. As I think back, I'm reminded of how the door kept closing on the casino building that we'd really had our heart set on Lord Street. And we'd go there and we'd feel all the wow, you know, like the euphoria of, wow, this could be our new church. And all it is that had for us. But how when we kept meeting with the owner and other people, the door just seemed to keep closing on it, that it just wasn't going to happen. And we were really disappointed with that. But you know, as disappointed as we might have been, that was all part of the journey that God was leading us on to bring us to this place here. Because then when we thought, well, where do we go? There's nowhere else. Malcolm had a phone call from our agent in the town telling us that this place was now back on the market and it was available for us to come and view. But you know, we'd never have gotten here if we hadn't been down all those other roads with the dead end in the first place. As we went down one, it began to open up an opportunity to explore something else that eventually led us to here. And here in this story, God took them on a bit of a strange route. One that was a little bit back and forth, one that to them might have seemed a little bit strange, I'm sure, because it wasn't the shortest route, but God knew what he was doing. He didn't want to take them along the quickest route because they'd come up against the Philistines, and that would potentially cause fear to rise in their hearts, and they'd just want to go straight back. He was trying to build faith in these people. But even the route he took them on had its fair share of risk and danger. But you know, through it all, it was a route that God was fully in control of. Let's not lose sight of that. It was a route where God would be able to position them exactly where he wanted them to be. That he was going to bring them to a place where the present seemed impassable and the future of being free seemed impossible. And I think it's really important to remind ourselves here, isn't it, that it was God who was leading them along this path. It wasn't Moses' idea to take them along that route, it was God's. He might have been the one they were all looking to. who they began to moan at when things didn't go as they hoped. Someone said there's probably about 2.5 million people. That's a lot of pressure on one man, isn't it? But ultimately, there was someone far bigger and greater who was in control of all of this. It was God himself. And as I read this, it serves as a reminder to me that, God's plans aren't always logical, are they? Anyone else discovered that? They don't always make sense to our human, finite minds. We're going to be celebrating Christmas in just over a month's time, and I guess if it was down to me or you to think of how we were going to save the world, I bet we wouldn't think of sending a little baby, would we? I saw the new James Bond movie last week. For me, I'd be wanting to send someone like him in. Or if you're American, Jason Bourne, who's their equivalent, or a superhero of some kind. But we read from what Isaiah tells us, chapter 55, that his ways are not our ways, are they? His thoughts aren't our thoughts. They're much higher, much grander. He sees things differently to how you and I so often see them. He has a much bigger perspective, doesn't he, over the things that we see. We only see just a little bit, but he sees the big picture. And the same was true here in this story to the people of Israel. What he was asking them to do didn't make a whole lot of sense, to start going back the way they'd come. But God had a move in mind that although it might have seemed a little bit oblivious to the people at that moment, he was simply waiting for the right time to reveal it. You see, his timing is so often different to ours, isn't it? We're there watching the clock. God, you should have come in by now. You should have moved. But God's got sometimes he's got a different agenda. He works to a different timetable to the one that we work to. And I think it's really important for us to remember this as we journey with him ourselves today, that we can't allow ourselves to be tricked into thinking that just because we might come up against what might appear to be a dead end to you and me, that God's not in control, that God's not interested, that God's not with us. You see, just like it was for the people here in this story, it might well be that he's actually led you to that place because he's got something in mind where he's going to reveal himself to you in a new way that's going to not only encourage you in your walk, but it's also going to take you through into the plans and purposes that he has for you. So if that's the place you find yourself in this morning, I want to encourage you, hang in there. Hang in there. Don't throw in the towel just yet. Keep pressing in, keep believing that God's going to bring you through to what he said to you. Because you see, if God has truly said it, he'll do it. Hello? If God has truly said it, he will do it. You see, he's a faithful God. Not only is his word true, but he's always true to his word. And if he's spoken that over your life, you can be rest assured that he will do it. As I said, it might not happen how you want it to or when you want it to, but let's not give up and think, God, you've abandoned me, because he doesn't do that, does he? What good father or mother would abandon their children and just give them up for nothing? He's a perfect father. But I think sometimes we can lose sight of this because, let's be honest, so often we view God as we do another person, don't we? We forget sometimes who he is, and we look at him as if he's just another one like you or me, but he's not human. He's far above all of us. We let each other down. We say that we're going to do things, and we don't always fulfill them, do we? But God's not like that. If he said he'll do it, he'll do it. The Bible's full of stories, isn't it, of how this is true. He said right after the fall in Eden that he'd send a Savior. A few thousand years. It wasn't until Jesus came in the form of a baby, but Galatians 4:4, at the right time, when the time had fully come, God sent his son to do what he called him to do, that we might receive the full rights of sons. He told Abraham he was going to be a blessing to the rest of the world. But that didn't happen overnight, did it? There was a waiting period for him and his wife. I'll mention more about that in a moment. He said to Moses that he's going to use him to set his people free. And we're reading about it here. Why? Because if God has said that he'll do it, he'll do it. Do you believe that this morning? You see, it was no surprise to him what was taking place. He knew how it was all going to pan out before it ever began, because he sees the end from the beginning, doesn't he? Aren't you glad about that when you think about your life, that he knows the end from the beginning? It isn't for us to know all the times and the dates and everything. I'm glad I don't know everything that's going to happen to me in the future. I might not like some of it. But he's in control. He has it all worked out, all mapped out, and here he had it all arranged ahead of time. He wasn't leading them back to trap them. He was leading them back to trap Pharaoh and reveal to all of the people there that he is God and that there is no one greater. He said he was going to take his people out of bondage, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was going to change that. I mentioned before about the promise he made to Abraham, or Abram, as he was called back then, and how he was not only going to bless Abram, but bless the world through him. But as we know, Abram and his wife Sarah, at that time, they had no children. I'm sure that was a topic of great disappointment for them as they looked around and saw all these other people with children, that they didn't have that blessing. And it was a dream, I'm sure, that had long been forgotten, that it was never going to happen now. Why? Because Abraham was 99 years old and his wife was 89 years old. You don't need me to tell you that from a reproductive point of view, there was no way they were going to ever have kids. If ever there was an impossible situation, well then this was it, wasn't it? And yet miraculously, with God's divine intervention, Isaac was born. And I love what we read in Romans 4 and verses 20 to 21, talking about Abraham. It said, having faced the fact that his and his wife's bodies were as good as dead. Anyone know what that feels like at times? They didn't waver through unbelief regarding what? Regarding the promise of God. But he was strengthened in his faith, and he gave glory to God. Listen to this. Being fully persuaded that God had the power to do what he had promised. Don't you love that? Being fully persuaded that God had the power to do what he had already and previously promised. In other words, he knew that in his own strength things were never going to change, but with God working behind the scenes, all things were possible. Are you hearing this, church? That if God had said it, he would do it. Where there seemed to be no way, he would make a way. And I don't know what things God may have spoken over your life in the past, but I really want to encourage you to hang in there. Just because it hasn't come to fruition, that doesn't mean that God has forgotten. I love what Paul writes to the church in Philippi, chapter 1 and verse 6, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion. He knows the plans he has for you. If he said he will do it, he will do it. It doesn't matter how long ago he might have said it. It really makes no difference to him what the situation or the circumstances surrounding your life might be screaming out to you right now. But where there might seem to be no way, he can make a way. And I want you to hang in there and trust him with that. That all things really are possible. But we have a part to play in it, don't we? It's not a case of where God will say, well, just go and sit down there and I'll just pour it all into your lap. It would be great if that happened, wouldn't it? How many of us would like that kind of blessing over our lives? But God often gives us things that we need to do in the process in order to be part of seeing the miracle happen. And I think it's important, and it's interesting because it really follows on with what Craig was leading us as we were worshiping earlier about God. We're here for you and we're listening to what you have to say. You see, because I believe that we need to be continually positioning ourselves in a place where we can listen to what God is saying to us, so that we can hear what he's saying, we can receive his instructions, but then we can also follow them too. You see, the key for Israel's deliverance here was for Moses to be listening to what God was saying. How else would they have gone along this windy path if no one was listening to what God was trying to communicate to them? Mark talked in his series he did last month on the presence of God, about how it's so important for us to keep pursuing the presence of God in our lives. He talked in that first message about how Moses would go to the tent of meeting, but everyone else would stand outside while Moses went into his. But all of us have got the ability, haven't we, to hear what God's saying to us. God wants to speak to all of us. But if we're going to see God break through in greater ways in our lives, even as a corporate fellowship, then we've got to make sure that we're walking closely with him, haven't we? Got to make sure that we're continuing to put him first in our lives and hearing what he's saying to us and then being willing to act upon it. Because hearing isn't enough in itself, is it? The Bible tells us don't just be hearers of the word, but be doers also, we've got to be able to live it out. And that can be scary. Does anyone else get scared at times following God? Doing the things that Jesus might be asking you to do? But nothing's changed, has it, over the past few thousand years, in that the one thing I believe that still releases God's blessing over our lives is our acts of obedience. There's some music playing in the background there. It's nice music. It's soothing. It's not mine, is it? But for me, as I look at this story, this is a story of trust and obedience. See, God wasn't interested in their opinions. They all had one. It tells us there, they all started crying out to the God. I'm sure they were telling him what they thought. But all God wanted was their obedience. Even when they didn't fully understand everything that was going on around them, all God was saying to them was, look, trust me. Trust me. Do what I'm asking you to do. Just trust and obey. What did they have to do? Verse 13, they had to not be afraid. Had to stand firm. Had to be still. Just know that peace. And of course, Moses had to stretch out his hand a little bit later on. But these were important words, I believe, that God wanted to get into the hearts of the Israelites so that they could get on board with his plan, where they could be filled with confidence and hope for all that he was about to accomplish in their midst. And the same is true for you and me today, isn't it? These same things that Moses said to the Israelite people still apply to you and me, I believe. We need to stand firm. We need to be still, know that he is God, that he's in control. We need to allow faith and confidence in him to fill our hearts, to get to that place where his peace can reign within us. Now, that's not always easy when you're finding yourself going through a difficult situation, but I believe that's a word for some of you here today. Be still and know that he is God. You see, so often we listen to the voice of the enemy, don't we? And all the negative stuff that he brings. Far more at times than we do to the one who knows all things and is above all things and can do all things. See, I believe miracles really do happen. But they don't always happen with flashing lights and acts of great power like Elijah had on Mount Carmel and all the stuff that happened there. I believe so often they happen where we simply position ourselves to hear what God says to us, and then we take a small step of obedience, and then we follow that with another one. And as long as we're listening to what he's saying, and we keep doing what he's telling us, well, then we walk the path, and the waters begin to part, and the miracle begins to take place. And here in this story, you see, the miracle wasn't down to Moses, was it? It was down to God. Moses just had to do what God had asked of him. But if he wasn't pulling himself in a place where he could hear what God was saying, it was never going to happen. You've got to be listening. What is it God's asking of you? What is it God's telling you to do? And then once you know that, are you doing what he's asked you to do? Because that could be the thing that begins to see the miracle take place. And then the last thing I want to say is this. We kind of allow fear to overtake our faith. You see, I believe God wants us to live in a place of faith and not a place of fear. But as I said before, there's someone who's always trying to get us to live in the place of fear instead of the place of faith, with all the stuff that's happened over the last 48 hours in Paris. It's just an attack of the enemy, isn't it? And a ploy to try and get people to live in fear. But so often we give in to him far more than we should do. I know I do. Anyone else brave enough to admit to that this morning? But our Christian life is a journey of faith. You see, without faith, it's what? It's impossible to please God. And what is faith? Faith is being sure of things hoped for, the substance of things not yet seen. It's that ability to trust God, even when the circumstances around you might be screaming out something completely different. Because faith is only faith when you act on it. And the truth is that faith and fear can't live together in the same heart, because one will always destroy the other. And what I've discovered is that we spend so much of our time living between these two places, between a place of faith and fear, just like the Israelites were here, with the back and forth, the to-ing and fro-ing that was taking place. You see, when they came out of Egypt, they were in a place of faith, I believe. I'm sure they were singing, they were dancing, the tambourines were playing, the hallelujah chorus was being sung. There wasn't a speck of fear in their hearts, because 400 years of history plus now was being broken, and they were moving on and into freedom. The adrenaline was pumping through their veins. They were moving forward. They were on a mission. And as long as they were doing that, everything was good. But what happened the minute they stopped moving forward and they stood still? Fear began to overtake them. With Pharaoh's army suddenly right up behind them, and this huge expanse of water in front, they were hemmed in. And the result of that, in verse 10, fear began to grip their hearts. They began to cry out, and panic and confusion came in. But of course, God hadn't brought them this far to let them get taken hostage again, had he? He's not that kind of father. So they had to put their faith in him and act on it. Even when they didn't fully understand all that was taking place, they had to learn to trust him. And this is what true faith is, isn't it, I believe? Depending on God and on what he says, even when it doesn't match up with our feelings or what we might be seeing taking place around us. It's not believing in spite of evidence. That's superstition. But rather obeying in spite of consequence. And when we've got faith in God's promises, then the result is that we have that peace in our hearts. You see, Moses was given the instruction to still go out and to stand. He had to exercise his faith. But that's when the miracle happened. The waters parted, they were able to go across on dry ground. And I believe the same is true for you and me today, that we've got to continually keep our eyes on the Lord and take those steps of faith. I wonder this morning, maybe Craig and the musicians, you can come back to lead us, because I want us to sing that song again in a few moments, Where There Is No Way, You Make a Way. But I wonder this morning, if you're finding that fear is having more of a say in your life right now, wherever you might be, maybe it's a sign that you've taken your eyes off God and you've begun to the situation around you. And you've stopped moving forward in your faith. You've come to a bit of a standstill. Maybe today, God is calling you by his Spirit to put your focus back on him. To let faith begin to rise up once more. Maybe to go back and do the thing that he last told you to do that you may have stopped doing for whatever reason. And get back in that place again where you're just opening up yourself for him to come and move in you and through you. You see, coming to the Red Sea is just as much a part of God's plan, I believe, as crossing it. We don't like it when those times happen, but God is in control. And he knows what he's doing because he's working out his perfect plans and purposes in our lives. And a predicament in God's hands is only a highway to a promised land and a better future. I don't know why he allows it. Might be because we have taken our eyes off him and he's calling us to put our focus back on him. Might be that he wants to do something within us, reveal something fresh about who he is. Maybe like it was for the Israelites, and to get Pharaoh out of their hair once and for all. He'll allow us to come to places where we have to deal with a situation or maybe issues of our character. And he says, enough's enough. You've been at this place long enough. We're going to deal with this so you can walk in greater freedom in the days to come. It could be a whole number of things, but what's the breakthrough that you need today? Is it in an area of a relationship? Is it something financial maybe? Is it something to do with your career? You're just at a bit of a dead end at the moment and you're just really believing God's given you a greater dream and vision for the future, but nothing seems to be opening up there. Maybe it's something to do with your walk with him. Maybe some sin has got some mastery over you that you just can't seem to break free from, and you need to face up to that, get help, get counsel, get prayer so that you can move on from it. What's the breakthrough that you need? And what areas is he calling you to trust him in? Where might he be saying to you today, I want you to stretch out your hand. I want you to take those first steps of obedience. But as you do that, you open up the door for him to come in and move in your life. You see, he's the Waymaker. Where there is no way, he makes a way. And as Craig and the team lead us in this song, I want to invite you forward for ministry. We've got a prayer ministry team, some people we've been working with, training up to help us in our prayers, prayer time. And if you'd really value someone standing with you today, if you feel that God has spoken to you, not my voice, but if you've felt that you've heard and sensed the Holy Spirit maybe just press in some things within your life, and you'd really value someone just to pray with you, I'd love you, just as we sing this song, to come forward, and there'll be a team of people ready to help pray with you and just stand with you, bring some encouragement, speak some life over you, let you know that you're not alone, but there's others around you, and that we have a God who can make a way where there is no way. And if you don't feel you need to come forward for prayer, and that's absolutely fine, let's, in these moments, let's be mindful of all the tragic events that have taken place in Paris and that are still continuing to unfold, and the full aftermath of that. And let's be praying for them in our own hearts and asking God to come in, that where there seems to be no way with that right now, that God would break in and just make something possible, just make a way, carve a path out so that we can put an end to this terrorist, that we can never have to be saddened by watching that on our TV screens again in these coming days. Why don't we all stand to our feet? And if that's you, as we sing this song, come forward, because we'd love to pray with you.